The cost of living crisis has turned normal life into a luxury subscription. Recently, you have probably heard that the economy is doing great. The numbers are strong. The charts are beautiful. The line is going up. Somebody in a suit is standing in front of a television screen explaining that everything is improving. Meanwhile, you are standing in a grocery store, holding a bag of coffee like you just uncovered an ancient Egyptian artifact. You look at the price, you look at the size of the bag, you look back at the price. Then you start examining the package for diamonds, microchips, or a small deed to the coffee plantation. Because apparently, this thing now requires financing. That is the cost of living crisis. It is the growing distance between what ordinary life costs and what ordinary people are paid. It is rent taking half your income, groceries conducting a weekly hostage negotiation with your debit card, health insurance charging you thousands of dollars for the privilege of later discovering that your doctor is out of network, and every basic service quietly becoming another subscription. Life itself has gone premium. Shelter is premium. Transportation is premium. Childcare is premium. Dental care is apparently a collector's edition. At this rate, breathing indoors will soon include ads unless you upgrade. And before the professional excuse makers arrive in the comments, no, this is not a video claiming every person who struggles has made perfect financial decisions. Of course, people waste money. Of course, some people take on stupid debt. Somewhere right now, somebody is using buy now, pay later to purchase a 7-foot Bluetooth lamp shaped like a duck. But millions of people did not suddenly become financially irresponsible at the exact same time. When housing, food, transportation, insurance, medical care, and utilities all become harder to afford across an entire country, that is not a mass outbreak of bad budgeting. That is a structural problem. And today, we are going to talk about it. Let us immediately deal with one of the most annoying arguments surrounding this issue. Inflation is coming down, so why are people still complaining? Because a lower inflation rate does not mean prices return to normal. If somebody punches you in the face 10 times, then reduces it to 3 punches next year, the punching rate has declined. Congratulations, your face is still losing the economic recovery. Inflation measures how quickly prices are changing. When inflation slows, prices are generally still rising, just more slowly. They do not magically reverse back to what they were before. The U.S. Consumer Price Index stood at 257.971 in January 2020. By June 2026, it was 333.952. That is an increase of roughly 29%. The Food at Home Index rose by about 32% over the same period. So when people say that their money does not stretch the way it used to, they are not hallucinating. Their dollar walked into a wood chipper and came out as store credit. And even after that enormous increase in the price level, consumer prices were still 3.5% higher in June 2026 than they had been 1 year earlier. Food was up 3%. Shelter was up 3.3%. Again, this is happening on top of all the previous increases. It is like climbing 30 flights of stairs, taking one slower step, and having somebody announce that you are basically back in the lobby. No, I am still on the 30th floor, my legs are on fire, and the elevator now charges a convenience fee. This matters because the largest parts of the household budget are not luxury purchases. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average U.S. household spent $26,266 on housing in 2024, equal to 33.4% of its total spending. Transportation consumed another 17%. Put those together, and more than half of household spending was gone before food, healthcare, clothing, education, debt, or the occasional reckless act of enjoying your own existence. Average food spending was another $10,169. This is not a budget. This is a pack of wolves dividing the paycheck. Housing takes a leg. Transportation grabs an arm. Food is chewing through the wallet. Healthcare is waiting behind a tree with a deductible. And housing is where this crisis becomes completely absurd. In 2024, 22.7 million renter households, 49% of all renters, spent more than 30% of their income on housing. Between 2019 and 2024, renters' median housing costs increased 38%, while their incomes rose only 28%. That difference is the crisis. Your income is jogging. Your rent is fleeing the police in a stolen Lamborghini. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition calculated that in 2025, a full-time worker needed to earn $33.63 an hour to afford a modest 2-bedroom rental without spending more than 30% of income on housing. For a modest 1-bedroom, the required wage was $28.17. The federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour, where it has been since 2009. The 2-bedroom housing wage is more than 4.5 times the federal minimum wage. Apparently, the official housing strategy is for one person to work 4 full-time jobs and then use the remaining -16 hours of the day to sleep. But whenever you bring up these numbers, an elite squadron of financial philosophers appears from the mist. First comes the stop buying coffee guy. This man believes the global housing crisis was created by cinnamon syrup. In his mind, landlords reviewed your Starbucks transaction history and raised rent across the country in self-defense. Let us say somebody spends $6 on coffee every single day. That's about $2,190 a year. Cutting that expense might help. I'm not saying it would not. But if your rent increased by hundreds of dollars a month, your insurance rose, your grocery bill climbed, and your car needed one repair that apparently required importing a sacred transmission from the Vatican. Personal budgeting can help an individual survive expensive conditions. It does not explain why those conditions exist. Telling people to skip coffee as a solution to housing costs is like telling passengers on the Titanic to save the ice in their drinks. Thank you, Captain Budget. The ship remains vertical in the wrong direction. Then we have the just move somewhere cheaper guy. Of course, moving can make sense for some people. But people do not exist as loose furniture. They have jobs, children, relatives, medical providers, custody arrangements, support networks, and moving costs. Cheaper places may also have lower wages, fewer jobs, limited public transportation, or rising housing costs of their own. And if every teacher, nurse, restaurant worker, delivery driver, cashier, and home health aide leaves an expensive city, who exactly is supposed to keep that city functioning? Are the buildings going to educate the children? Is a venture capital presentation going to drive the ambulance? Will the luxury condominium descend from the heavens and unclog its own toilet? Just move is not an economic policy. It is a loading screen tip. Next comes the get a better job guy. This argument sounds intelligent for approximately 4 seconds. Yes, individuals can train, negotiate, change careers, or seek better employment. Good advice. But society still needs millions of supposedly low-skill jobs performed every day. We need caregivers, we need food workers, we need cleaners, we need warehouse workers, we need classroom aides. We need people stocking stores at 4 a.m. so the get a better job guy can purchase protein powder before recording a podcast about discipline. If a job is necessary enough that society collapses when nobody performs it, then the person doing it should be able to afford shelter and food. You cannot solve an economy-wide affordability problem by telling every worker to individually climb into the top 10%. That is not how percentages work. That is a pyramid scheme wearing a necktie. Another common response is that wages are rising. They are. The relevant question is whether they are rising faster than the cost of living, and for whom. In June 2026, real average hourly earnings for private sector workers were only 0.1% higher than 1 year earlier. 0.1%. Everybody remain calm. Do not spend this historic windfall in one place. Maybe buy half of an onion and place the rest into a diversified portfolio. And remember, an average is not every person's experience. Averages can rise while millions of workers remain stuck, especially when housing and other essential costs vary wildly by location and circumstance. That is why telling somebody average wages are up may be statistically true and personally useless. If Bill Gates walks into a bar, the average customer becomes a millionaire. The bartender still cannot pay rent with the atmosphere. Then there is healthcare. In 2025, the average annual premium for employer-sponsored family health coverage reached $26,993. Workers directly contributed an average of $6,850 toward those premiums. That is before many families pay deductibles, co-pays, co-insurance, prescriptions, dental bills, vision costs, or the mysterious administrative fee charged because somebody in an office moved a PDF 6 inches to the left. Health insurance in America sometimes feels like paying a bouncer $500 a month to stand outside the hospital and decide whether our organs meet the dress code. This is why people just need to budget better becomes so insulting. Budget what? Should a parent choose the economy brand asthma attack? Should somebody schedule their broken tooth for a quarter with stronger revenue? Should an uninsured person tell their appendix to hold a stakeholder meeting? There are only so many expenses you can cut before budgeting becomes a polite word for going without. The Federal Reserve found that only 63% of adults said they could cover a hypothetical $400 emergency entirely with cash or its equivalent in 2024. That means 37% could not. The same survey found that 79% of adults changed their behavior in response to higher prices. 15% had used buy now, pay later, and nearly 1/4 of those users had paid late. So people are adjusting. They are spending differently. They are delaying purchases. They are stacking payment plans on top of credit cards on top of hope. You can only rearrange the deck chairs so many times before discovering that the furniture is now financed at 29% interest. By the first quarter of 2026, total U.S. household debt had reached $18.8 trillion, including $1.25 trillion in credit card balances. Debt is not automatically proof of desperation. People use credit for many reasons. But when basic expenses rise faster than household breathing room, credit becomes the bridge, and some people are being asked to live on that bridge permanently. And because this channel talks about climate change and collapse, we need to discuss the part of the cost of living crisis that is going to become much harder to ignore. Climate risk is becoming a household expense. The U.S. Treasury found that from 2018 through 2022, average homeowners' insurance premiums rose 8.7% faster than inflation. Homeowners in the 20% of zip codes with the highest expected losses from climate-related hazards paid average premiums of $2,321, 82% more than homeowners in the lowest-risk 20%. Non-renewal rates were also higher in the areas facing the greatest expected losses. This is how climate change enters the cost of living crisis. Not only through a dramatic disaster on television, but through the renewal notice. The grocery bill after a crop failure, the electricity bill during a heat wave, the tax money used to rebuild infrastructure, the rent increase after housing is destroyed, the insurance company deciding your home has become too exciting to cover. Collapse does not always arrive wearing football pads and driving through the desert. Sometimes it arrives as an email saying your premium increased 34%. Sometimes it is a family delaying medical care to pay the electric bill. Sometimes it is a teacher moving an hour away from the school where they work. Sometimes it is millions of people doing everything right and still watching stability move farther away. The worst detractors treat suffering as proof of personal failure because that explanation is emotionally convenient. If every struggling person is lazy, irresponsible, spoiled, or addicted to avocado toast, then the system requires no examination. Nothing has to change. You can look at a full-time worker sleeping in a car and reassure yourself that somewhere, somehow, that person purchased an unauthorized sandwich. But the numbers do not support that cartoon. Half of renters being cost-burdened is not a personality defect. A housing wage above $33 an hour is not caused by streaming subscriptions. Family health premiums approaching $27,000 are not the result of insufficient hustle. Nearly 4 in 10 adults being unable to cover a $400 emergency entirely with cash is not a tiny collection of irresponsible outliers. At some point, when the same problem affects tens of millions of people, personal responsibility stops being an explanation and becomes a hiding place. Personal responsibility matters. So does institutional responsibility. So does corporate responsibility. So does government responsibility. Funny how the people who preach responsibility with the intensity of a medieval priest usually run out of responsibility the moment it reaches anybody with a lobbying budget. There is no single button that fixes the cost of living. Anyone selling one magical solution is probably about to ask you to join a webinar. Housing requires more homes where people actually need them, fewer artificial barriers to building, protection against abuse, preservation of affordable units, and serious public investment for people the private market will not serve. Work requires stronger pay, bargaining power, predictable schedules, and wage floors that are connected to the century we currently live in. Healthcare requires reducing the amount families pay merely to access care, and making prices understandable before a medical bill arrives, written in ancient Sumerian. Markets require competition. When a handful of companies dominate an essential industry, consumers cannot meaningfully shop around. You cannot comparison shop your way out of an emergency room, a regional utility monopoly, or the only apartment within commuting distance of your job. And climate policy is cost of living policy. Stronger infrastructure, efficient homes, cleaner and more reliable energy, disaster preparation, better land use decisions, and honest insurance regulation can reduce the enormous bills that arrive after preventable damage. On an individual level, yes, make a budget. Avoid high-interest debt where possible. Compare insurance. Negotiate pay. Learn useful skills. Share housing if that is safe and practical. Build an emergency fund when you can. Those actions can protect you. But survival advice is not a substitute for solving the conditions that make survival increasingly difficult. An umbrella is useful in a storm. It is not a climate policy. So let us recap. Prices are roughly 29% higher than they were in early 2020. Grocery prices are up by about a third. Almost half of renters are cost-burdened. A modest 2-bedroom requires a wage more than 4 times the federal minimum. Family health insurance premiums are approaching $27,000. Real hourly earnings barely moved over the latest year. Household debt is enormous. Climate risk is making insurance and basic stability even more expensive. And the response from some people is still, have you considered not buying coffee? Yes, Brad, thank you. 22 million cost-burdened renters have been waiting for your beam-based economic recovery plan. The cost of living crisis is not imaginary. It is not created by pessimism. And it will not disappear because somebody points at one improving statistic, while ignoring the price level, housing burden, debt, healthcare costs, and climate risk surrounding it. People are not asking for a yacht, a private island, and a personal falcon trained to retrieve DoorDash. They are asking whether full-time work should provide a stable place to live, food, transportation, healthcare, and enough breathing room to survive one unexpected bill. That used to be considered a normal expectation. Now it is treated like a deluxe package. And that is the real warning. When ordinary life becomes unaffordable, People delay families, avoid doctors, abandon communities, work through exhaustion, and lose faith in institutions that keep telling them everything is fine. That is how a cost of living crisis becomes a social crisis. That is how a social crisis becomes political instability. And that is how collapse begins, not always with one spectacular event, but with millions of people slowly discovering that the future no longer fits inside the budget. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, share it with somebody who has been personally victimized by a grocery receipt, and tell me in the comments which expense has increased the most where you live. Subscribe to The Human Forecast for more commentary on climate change, collapse, and what these forces mean for ordinary people.